series, this is kind of building on the idea of our interdisciplinary mission. So the Awesome Speakers is meant to be kind of a very accessible virtual event for everybody. That's basically consisting of a series of talks from some of the brightest researchers and scholars who are working to rigorously understand how complex social media is, as well as the internet and technology and its impact on the world. So if you're interested in sort of hearing more about this kind of stuff, I have a link to the events page on the slide, and this will include details about future talks. I think if you find this talk interesting, you'll probably be interested in some of the other speakers that we have lined up. Now, with that, I will, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joshua Tucker. Dr. Tucker is a professor of politics, affiliated professor of Russian and Slavic studies, and affiliated professor of data science at New York University. He's director of NYU's Jordan Center for Advanced Study of Russia and co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics. His research focuses on the intersection of social media and politics in a number of areas. I'll sort of plug a few here. So some of his research is focusing on partisan echo chambers, online hate speech, the effects of social media on political knowledge, as well as disinformation and fake news, and Russian bots and trolls. Today, in particular, he's going to be speaking about work that was recently published in Nature Communications about Russian Internet Research Agency's foreign influence campaign on Twitter in the 2016 election and its relationship to attitudes and voting behavior in particular. In the chat, I'm going to include a link to this paper for you to check out if you like, as well as a link to his personal website, research lab, and then also a link to an interesting new political science textbook that Josh is helping to develop called A Political Science Experiment. I don't know too much about this. From what I understand, it's sort of a new concept that's trying to crowdsource the writing of the chapters and then charging students only $1 for those chapters. So Josh, I'll let you talk more about that if you're interested. And then structurally, what we're going to do here to keep things running smoothly is that we're going to ask everybody to save their questions until after, and then we'll sort of give Josh 10 or 15 minutes to at the end to answer questions. So with that, I will pass things off to Josh. Thank you, and please put your hands together.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Thanks for inviting me. I'm incredibly flattered to be the first awesome speaker of the semester, and thanks to all of you for sharing some time here today. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about exposure to the Russian Internet Research Agency foreign influence campaign on Twitter in the 2016 U.S. election and its relationship to attitudes and voting behavior, which of course is a title that could only have been foisted on someone by a journal editor. But I'm going to give a little bit of background on it and share a little bit of our other research as I lead into this paper. Okay, so the situation of this, if you all kind of remember and go back, I've been studying social media and politics at this point long enough that I can remember back when social media was going to be a real boon for politics, because it was going to help people around the world who had to deal with authoritarian governments, give them a way to communicate. It was going to help people in established democracies who weren't really paying that much attention to the news to become better informed citizens, because they would see news articles that their friends were sharing from high school who they had, gone online to reconnect with. Of course, in 2016, we had a real kind of turning point, and 2015 outside the US, if you think about Brexit, in terms of beginning to think about the impact of the internet on democracy. And a lot of things kind of came out of this 2016 election campaign. This is Nate Persley's article about Can Democracy Survive the Internet? We wrote a piece trying to explain how social media could be both liberation technology and can democracy survive the internet in the Journal of Democracy, called From Liberation to Turmoil. But at a big point of this inflection was the understanding that the internet could be harnessed not just for the kind of hijinks of people doing things on the internet, not just for democratic activists who were trying to coordinate and protest in authoritarian states, but also it could be a way for foreign governments or foreign actors to interfere in the US presidential election. And this received a great deal of attention when shortly after the election, thanks and in part to some of the amazing work done by people who are at Indiana and who are part of this seminar here today, there was a lot of attention paid to what was actually going on online, and there was attention paid to trolls and bots, but there was this big question about Russian foreign interference. And there was this narrative that kind of took hold, you see by the Michelle Goldberg quote here, that somehow what happened with Russian trolls online during the 2016 US elections had an impact on the outcome of that election. And in the lower left-hand corner here, if you guys are not familiar with this, this was the building in St. Petersburg, Russia, where the Internet Research Agency was running, and this was the home of the kind of famous Russian trolls. So for those of you who are not as familiar with Russian trolls, this is how we came to know them, right? So there were, Twitter was called to testify before US Congress about the existence of these Russian trolls. And as part of that congressional testimony, Twitter put into the public record in their congressional testimony a list of accounts that Twitter had identified as being Russian trolls. And I'll talk in 1 second about what we mean by exactly what we mean by a troll. Now, at that time, Twitter had deactivated all the accounts and deleted the tweets of those accounts that had identified as these Russian trolls. But we still had a situation where lots of us were sitting on data that we had collected over the course of the election. And so I know many of you in this room, but also we did the same thing. We went back through our collections and we started trying to find tweets by these accounts. Twitter then later actually released its collection that academics could get access to of all the tweets from all of these accounts for public analysis. And this was actually, of course, much better because it wasn't dependent on what you had happened to collect during the course of the election. You had a complete collection of these data sets. I want to give a huge kudos to Twitter for doing this. It spawned a bunch of research. Everything I show you here today is possible because of this data set that Twitter released. But I do want to caveat, this is a giant black box, right? We don't know how Twitter decided what was a troll. We also don't know if Twitter released all the troll data. We know that Twitter released a data set that was filled with data that they claimed was troll data. So that's the caveat for everything I'm going to show you here today. We're both simultaneously grateful to Twitter for making this data available and allowing all this kind of research, but it's also a question. It also remains a question that we don't actually know where these came from. So it's a black box here. So that's the caveat. Okay, so what is a Russian troll? We meet a Russian troll, right? I give other talks where I talk about, and not maybe for this crowd, not necessarily the difference between bots and trolls. The way I think about this is bots tend to be automated accounts that are producing content based on algorithms, as opposed to people sitting and typing, whereas trolls are accounts that are people sitting and typing information for their posts, but they're not the people who they claim to be. So that's the big distinction here. There's deception involved. The troll is pretending to be someone they're not. So if you look at this particular troll, American Gunslinger at USA Gunslinger, right? This looks like this is someone in the United States. This doesn't look like this is some 24-year-old in St. Petersburg, Russia, who's trying to make some extra money. And so that's what makes this a troll. You know, we also use the term cyborg to refer to accounts that produce some automated content and some human-generated content. What I'm going to call trolls for the rest of this talk undoubtedly probably contained, you know, cyborgs in addition to just trolls. I'm sure some of the content was produced by automated means. All right, so the extant literature on IRA trolls, when we started working on this at the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, had tended to focus on the text of tweets by these trolls, the bios of those tweets, and the networks that they were embedded in. And if you're not familiar with this literature, I would really suggest you look at some of this wonderful work that's been done by Patrick Warren and Darren Linville at Clemson. Darren, I think, is the only person I know who's like read every tweet by one of these Russian troll accounts or something close to it. Kate Starbird's lab at the University of Washington was doing really interesting work on the networks in which these trolls were embedded. We had evidence of left trolls and left-leaning trolls and right-leaning trolls from the work that, in particular, Patrick and Darren had done. There was some debate over whether this was balanced. And of course, it doesn't mean that trolls were helping the left and right equally. And so when we first jumped into this at CSMAP, the first kind of work we did with this data was we started looking at hyperlinks that were shared by trolls. So not the content of the messages on the networks, but actually what links they were sharing to and what websites they were sharing these links. And we had some interesting findings in our first work on this. We showed that what I thought was the most interesting thing is that these trolls were not generally sharing a lot of junk news, but they were actually sharing a ton of local news. And we used some baselines here. We had a random sample of Twitter users at the time. We also were able to go through that and get a random draw from our random sample politically interested Twitter users. So we found some things that, like, yes, trolls were sharing more junk news than politically interested users were, but they were really sharing a lot more linked to local news. And 10, 15 times as much local news as our politically interest group and 90 times as much as our random sample. And this is a chart over time of how this was taking place. If anyone wants to look at some of this data, this was what we called a CSMAP data report. It's up on our website. We also did a paper where we began to look at the divergence between the links that these Russian trolls were sharing to news media versus to YouTube. Now, there's a caveat here. The YouTube stuff is hand-coded. We didn't at that point in time have a way of automating the ideology of YouTube videos. We now have other work that does that. But we found these kind of interesting patterns in the sense that we sort of replicated what had been found in other work about these left trolls and right trolls, and that we found that trolls were actually sharing links to liberal media sites, moderate media sites, and conservative media sites. It wasn't just all one thing. But on our take on the most popular links that they shared to YouTube videos, however, presented a different picture, with trolls sharing more links to YouTube, to conservative YouTube URLs, proportionally many more links to conservative YouTube URLs. We also found some other interesting, evidence of kind of sophisticated behavior. This is a chart that tracks over time the political ideology of the links that were being shared. So the links, were they being shared to liberal sources or to conservative sources? And what was interesting here is that if you buy the story that the trolls were trying to increase partisanship in the US at the time of over this time of election period, then this is kind of clever, right? They start off, the right-leaning trolls and left-leaning trolls both start off kind of sharing fairly moderate links to moderate news sources. But over time, those links, especially on the conservative side, are getting increasingly more conservative. So it's like maybe they suck you in with the moderate stuff, and then over time there's this kind of divergence here. So that we thought that was kind of interesting. You could also look at the trolls at the individual level and look at trolls that were sharing, were they sharing, this is our YouTube on the y-axis and our mean links to news sources on the right axis, on the x-axis. And yeah, it does mainly line up along this axis, which sort of makes sense if we think about there are right-leaning trolls and left-leaning trolls. But there is this other interesting thing here, right, where we see, again, following on this idea that there were a bunch of individual trolls that were sharing links to more liberal news sources, but still sharing links to very conservative YouTube videos. So if you've got, again, this idea that they're being kind of clever, sucking people in to, by saying, look, we're sharing the Boston Globe and the Washington Post, but then, hey, check out this right-wing YouTube video. So this is appeared in an article in the International Journal of Press and Politics that appeared a couple of years ago. All right, so this is all by way of kind of lead in to the paper that Matt was talking about and that he asked me to come here and talk about today. In the sense that even with the additional information that we were able to provide, with the stuff that we provided on these links, I think it played into a lot of what we were learning about the behavior of these trolls. However, even after all these kind of interesting work had been published, mining this data set that Twitter released to tell us in detail kind of what these trolls were doing, we still didn't really know anything about exposure, who was being exposed to these trolls over the course of the 2016 US presidential campaign, or about impact, right? Was there any impact of being exposed to these trolls? And again, the narrative that sort of permeated general conversation was that these trolls had mattered for the course of the election. And then we realized after a while, and after we saw this really incredible work that was done by Chris Bale and Sunshine Hilligus and others at Duke University, with a somewhat similar research design, but they had data for October of 2017, that we actually were in possession of the data to be able to do this. So let me explain how we're able to now come to you and finally tell people about exposure to this trolls, and then look at some correlations with things that we care about in terms of exposure. So we were running a panel survey at the time of the 2016 election. That means we surveyed people about their opinions and their candidate preferences in April 2016, and we surveyed them again in October of 2016 about their attitudes, and then we got their vote choice after the election. For close to 1,500 people in this sample, we knew their Twitter handles. This was part of the SOMA panel that at UGO. So for these 1,500 people whose Twitter handles we had as part of this study, we were able to go out and actually collect the follower, every account that they were following. So we found all of everyone who they were following on Twitter. And then for everyone, each of these 1,500 people who were following, we collected every single tweet from every single person they were following over the course of the 2000 election campaign. What this meant was we had, from April of 2016, when we surveyed them the first time, until the end of the election, when they had seen all of we knew every tweet that could have appeared in the feeds of the people in our survey. This turned out to be a total of 1.2 billion tweets. But we could then cross-check that list of 1.2 billion tweets with the list of the tweets by the Russian trolls that Twitter had released. And so what that meant was not only did we know if the people in our accounts were following these trolls, but we knew if anyone else they were following had retweeted a tweet from one of these trolls. So what this meant was our data, we realized, actually had exposure, because remember, this is pre-For You feeds. This is reverse chronological feed days still. So we're getting all the tweets that could have appeared in their timeline. Now, it's not a perfect estimate. We still wish and always wish that Twitter had actually released exposure data in the API. But we take this as a proxy for the tweets that people could have seen in their timelines. It's also possible that people were searching for other things and they may have seen other things. But on average, we think the use of the tweets you could have seen is a great proxy for the tweets that you did see. And so when you take this, the data we had data on potential exposure, and we had data on attitudes and vote over time. So we can do two things with this data. We can characterize the nature of that exposure, and we can also look to see if there's any correlation between being exposed to tweets by these Russian trolls and changes in attitudes, either in a left-wing direction or right-wing direction, or becoming more polarized, which was what the hypothesis was, or in whether there was any relationship to it with vote change. And I'll explain exactly how we had to do that in a moment. All right. So what does the data look like? It's an interesting data set. I know many in this room have dug into it before, but this is what the data looks like from April of 2016 to November of 2016, which is our sample time. You'll notice that there are a couple other foreign influence campaigns that are going on, but for this one in 2016, as has been widely reported, the vast majority of the tweets were coming from Russian trolls. So we're going to focus on what the Russian trolls were doing from here on in. Now, if you look at this chart, you'd say, if you actually run the numbers, it turns out that over the time of this election campaign, we had something, it began to hit the point where it was like people were seeing, on average, the average person in our sample was seeing potentially up to 5 tweets per day, or 4 to 5 tweets per day from a Russian troll. And it even peaks up around 14 on election day, which kind of sounds like a lot. But it turns out that this exposure was heavily, heavily concentrated. So I want to draw your attention to panel B in this figure. And what's on the x-axis here is a logarithmic scale of what percentage of our respondents account for what percentage of our exposures. And what you see here is that 1% of our respondents account for almost 75% of the exposure to Russian trolls. So think about this for a second. We have 1,500 people. This is 15 people are accounting for 75% of these potential exposures. So much like so many other things that we keep looking at on the internet, we're finding this logarithmic distribution here, or power law distribution. If we go just a little bit farther out on the graph to the 10% line, we see that 10% of our respondents account for 99% of these potential exposures. So despite all of the attention paid to these Russian trolls, 90% of our sample had basically no exposure to them. Now, the other thing that we could do was we could actually compare exposure to Russian trolls with exposure to other potential sources of information about the election. And so we decided to go and look, because we had these 1.2 billion tweets. We could look for how much people saw from politicians, who we assume was talking about the election. We can also look at how much information people saw from the news media. And on the right-hand side of this figure, that's the information people were getting from Russian trolls. This figure on the lower right-hand side is one of my favorite figures we've ever put in a paper. This is the median number of potential exposures. Remember, these are ceilings, not floors. Potential exposures, the median number of potential exposures of our survey respondents, which of course was 0, because 90% of people barely saw anything. But if you look at the relative difference between politicians, you know, it's many, many, many times more tweets being seen from politicians. But then when you look at news media, it's an order of magnitude more information from news media. So this is a second clue to what was going on with exposure to these Russian trolls. One is that it's heavily concentrated in a small portion of the population. And the second is that it's basically just a drop in the bucket of what people are seeing about the election, even just on Twitter, to say nothing of what they're seeing on television news, what they're getting from their friends and family, what they're seeing in campaign advertisements, what they're seeing on other platforms. So we're talking about a really, really small amount of potential exposure to information relative to what else people are being exposed to. The next thing we could do, because we had survey data linked to this social media data, and this is the kind of power of linking social media of digital trace data with survey data, is we could actually look and see who was exposed to these Russian trolls. And what we find is that it is exactly the type of people who one would think were already likely to vote for Donald Trump, which is strong Republicans and men, basically. All right, so now we get to the kicker. And the kicker here is, do we see any difference between any relationship between being exposed to more of these tweets and changing your opinion on issues, or becoming more polarized on issues? And the bottom line here is, if you look across all of these estimates, they're all basically straddling 0. And by the way, these are not even corrected for multiple hypothesis testing. These are just the actual estimates here. So in our sample, we find basically no relationship between being exposed to more tweets by these trolls and having changed your position on issues, either in one direction or becoming more polarized. And then this is the fun for vote choice. So unfortunately, in April of 2016, we weren't asking people, who do you prefer between Clinton and Trump, because people didn't think Trump was going to get the nomination at that point in time when we put the surveys into the field. But we were able to find a variety of different measures that we could do using rankings and feeling thermometers and things like that. And what we look at here is, we could look at how candidates were ranked, and did we go from Clinton? We looked at this in a few different ways. Did it seem like there was a relationship between exposure and moving from supporting Clinton to moving to supporting Trump? Did it look like there was a relationship between exposure and moving from supporting Clinton towards Trump, or supporting a third party, or not voting? Or did it look like there was a relationship between moving from Trump to Clinton in how you rank the candidates? If anything, all of our best guesses, the point estimates from these analyses, actually suggest more exposure to the trolls led people to be more pro-Clinton. Now, obviously, the error bars are wide on these things, and we're not claiming that that's the case. So these are basically a bunch of null effects here. All right. So what do we know now? Okay, we now know a lot more about people's exposure and the extent to which there's any sort of relationship. Now, even if we had found a relationship, we would have had to go a lot farther to sort of claim whether this was a causal relationship, but we didn't even find a relationship in the first place. So we now know that there was non-trivial exposure to these Russian trolls, but that it was heavily concentrated, and it was among those most likely to support Trump. We also know that there was orders of magnitude more exposure to media and politicians' tweets than there was to Russian trolls' tweets. Whether we think it's now, I would say not surprisingly, based on what we know about this exposure, but maybe surprisingly based on the received wisdom, we know there's absolutely no relationship to issue polarization and no systematic relationship to vote choice. If you want to take a look at the paper, I think Matt said he put it in the chat, but this is a citation for the paper as well. Now, I want to be really clear. that what this study does not show, because this did get a lot of media attention and a lot of discussion online and social media, actually, when it first came out. First off, we know nothing about trolls on Facebook. We know there were attempts to use Russian trolls on Facebook as well. This is solely a study of what happened on Twitter. We don't know anything about the Russian ad spending on Facebook. And so this study can't tell us anything about that. This study also cannot tell us anything about the impacts of hacking and leaking, the work by Kathleen Hall Jameson that she has worked on. So this study doesn't measure any of that. It can't tell us anything positive or negative about any of those. This is simply a study about the impact of what happened on, or not the impact, what was the exposure on Twitter and the relationship between exposure on Twitter and possibility of people changing opinions on issues or changing candidate preference. Now, I apologize for the fact that I even have to say this, but I want to be very, very clear publicly. Our paper does not show that Russian foreign interference campaign was a hoax. It actually starts from the premise that the Russian foreign interference campaign happened, and then it tries to measure what the exposure to that campaign was and to see if there's any relationship between that exposure and variables of income and outcomes of interest that people have spoke about previously. But to be very clear, we start from the premise that there was a Russian foreign interference campaign. So claiming that our study shows that the Russian foreign interference campaign was a hoax is not a correct interpretation of what we were doing. If you want to find more about it, the paper's in Nature Communications. I did a tweet thread when it first came out, which you can go and find, which has, summarizes all these kind of points. Then we did a tweet thread after a few of the initial reactions online to try to clarify exactly what I just said here about the caveats at the end there. Let me close with one big thought here before we turn it over to question and answer. One thing that I've come to think a lot about in the aftermath of doing this research, but also in returning to sort of my generic political behavior roots about people who study political behavior and political science know how hard it is to change things like preference for president, right? I could probably tell you right now who 90% of the country is going to vote for in 2024, even if I don't know who the candidates are going to be. The Russian foreign influence campaign, and we talk about this at the very end of the paper, the Russian foreign influence campaign in 2016 may not have had much of an impact on people's attitudes about issues. It may not have had much of an impact on what they decided to do in the course of that election. That doesn't mean two things. One, it doesn't mean that it's not something that the US government should have and should in the future continue to take as a national security threat. When foreign powers try to interfere in the sanctity of the US democratic process, that should be seen as a real threat to the country. We don't know if this was in 2016 a probe to see how the US would respond, and it was trying to see if more serious attacks, such as hacking the actual electoral infrastructure, would be deterred by the response of the US to this. It can simultaneously be the case that we should take seriously the national security threat of a foreign power trying to interfere in our elections, even if we think the impact of that interference at that particular point in time was minimal in terms of impacting outcomes. The second point I want to make, which we get to at the end of the paper, is that this paper has been about the direct effects, right? Trying to look at the relationship between seeing these tweets and whether becoming more polarized or becoming more likely to vote for a particular candidate, was there a relationship there? That's what I would call the direct effects. But there was a very indirect effect from what happened during this campaign, which is that in the aftermath of the election, there was a lot of chatter about how the Russians changed the outcome or may have changed the outcome of our election campaign. And I have found myself in the subsequent years, especially since we've done this research, and especially since I've watched how the US 2020 election unfolded, wondering if the biggest impact of this campaign may have actually been these indirect effects of getting people talking about how a foreign power could have changed the outcome of the election and sowing in Americans a sense of fragility around the robustness of our electoral system, which is actually quite robust. And so when we get to 2020, and suddenly we get all these other claims about how easy it would have been for Venezuelans to have hacked voting machines and changed outcomes, I wonder if what happened in 2016 in some ways set the stage for that by this indirect impact of the Russian influence campaign. So it may have been that the campaign on the part of the Russians, if the goal was actually to change people's behavior in the 2016 election, there may be many good reasons to be skeptical that that happened, but there may simultaneously be reasons to think that that campaign actually did have an impact on undermining the quality of democracy in the United States. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to taking your questions and discussing all this further.
Thank you so much, Josh. It was very interesting. Yes, lots of hands going up here. So as I mentioned before, we're going to do question and answering here. I think a good idea. I see somebody's got raised hands already. So right, please raise your hand and I'll try to take the questions up. So Shohana, you are the first hand on my screen, so I'll let you go first if you could unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Actually, it was a very nice and intriguing talk. I'm a PhD student. Actually, I am doing research on trolling. So this was really nice to get the insights. So I just have one question though. As you found no correlation in voting impact based on the exposure, but do you think heavily concentrated contents may impact on voter thoughts online? Because we did a study. Actually, it's published now. So we did trolling analysis based on the election cycle, 2016 and 2020 election cycles. What we found is that a shift in trolling pattern, like from international trolling to domestic trolling. So if you think from the perspective of Russian trolls, they may not impacted the voters' voting choices, but they somehow succeeded in pushing real people to become the trolls and impacting their character choices in online. So that might have a long-term effect in online social media environment.
That is a great point. I mean, it's a super interesting question. And I think it also, I like the idea because this is another one of what I would call these indirect effects, right? Like it's not a direct impact, it's an indirect impact. And I remember I was being interviewed. So as Matt mentioned in the beginning, my background is all in post-communist politics. And I was being interviewed at one point at a post-com politics conference about whether or not I thought the Russians were going to interfere in the Mexican elections, which I think were in 2017. And my answer was, I have no idea if the Russians are going to want to interfere in the Mexican elections, but you know who might want to interfere in the Mexican elections are Mexicans, right? Because they have the highest stake in the outcome of the election. And so I've often thought about this as a toolkit as well. And so it's opened up this toolkit. And I remember making exactly this point as we were going into 2020 and everyone was getting, and between 2016 and 2020, and everyone was getting very fixated on presenting foreign influence, that the cat might have been out of the bag on this. And this was a set of toolkits on how you could do things. That being said, I am still, this research has taught me, I think, to be cautious, right? Because, in some ways, we're in a moment right now where there's, which we are calling, revenge of the political behaviorist a little bit, right? Like we're in a moment right now where we're seeing across multiple studies that it's harder to move attitudes. Like it's much harder to move polarization than we think it is, right? And I would want to be cautious. So you may absolutely be right that it led to an uptick in domestic trolling, but I would also want to see the research showing whether or not domestic trolling is having an impact on these outcomes. And look, we know these are complex ecosystems, so there could be lots of things going on. It is very hard to change people's partisanship. It is very hard to change people's decision on who they're going to vote for president, right? And if we think about the cacophony of information that surrounds an election in the United States across friends and neighbors, television, talk radio, political advertisements, social media, different social media platforms, text platform, video platforms, right? The idea that any one of these things, and there's literally a debate in American politics about whether campaign advertising matters at all, right? There are billions of dollars spent on campaign advertising, and no one's quite clear whether it has much of an effect at the national level. And so I do think we'd still want to take this rigor to the question of it. That being said, that's not the only outcome variable we necessarily want to care about, right? Like the rise of domestic trolling may lead to the silencing of certain types of voices. And if we have domestic trolls are more likely to go after people from underrepresented groups, right? And more likely to go after women. That may ultimately have an impact, even if it's not changing people's votes. It might change the nature of the conversation online on these platforms. And these might be things that we care very much about from an equity standpoint, from a normative standpoint, but also from a quality of democracy standpoint.
Beautiful. Thank you. Phil, you are up next. You are muted.
Sorry. So thanks, Josh. Great talk. Really, really insightful. And also, I want to take a moment to thank you for joining our series, but also to thank Matt and Caitlin for organizing this awesome speaker series. So thanks. And thanks everybody for joining. So my question, well, I have two questions. One is about the black box that you mentioned at the beginning. This analysis is based on a set of accounts that Twitter told us were part of these influence campaigns, but we don't know how they got them, and we don't know how complete this collection was. There may have been others that they haven't caught, and there may have been others that were indirectly part of this campaign. For example, bots that were just amplifying this content, or later probably also many other sort of domestic participants who participated. So they might have been the seeds of a broader campaign where some people were possibly just without being aware of it supporting it. So any thought that you have on that, like could there be additional exposures that were harder to account for? And number two question was actually you've partly already addressed it about these indirect effects, just like Shohana was asking. I was thinking of other ones. For example, the fact that the trolls may have been able to push certain topics to go trending, which might have helped shape the if not the voting outcomes, but perhaps the topics of conversations, or they might have supported certain partisan sources, which may have then become more popular. And those are other potential indirect effects that might have had some impact later on. So any thoughts that you have on these additional potential factors?
Sure. Yeah. So on the black box, the first thing is if there were bots that were amplifying, our study would have caught that. That's the beauty of the design we had, as opposed to only being able to relying on who followed the bots, on knowing the full information environment, and having these 1.2 billion tweets. If there were bots amplifying it and they were following those bots, or they were following people who retweeted those bots, we would have caught it. So any sort of attempt to amplify these tweets is captured in everything I've just shown you here, which includes this massive, power law distribution with this tiny percentage being for the thing. Now, if that's an answer to the second part of the first question. The first part of the first question, if Twitter missed stuff, then there's nothing we can do about it. This is the problem. This continues to be. While we're on the problem here, right? We got 1.2 billion tweets here, right, for this study. This study cannot be replicated in 2024 under the new API things. It would literally cost us $1 trillion. I'm making that number up, but it's kind of like that, right? It's a very large number. And so this is a big problem. We had a moment of transparency. It took us a while. We were very fortuitous that we had this survey in the field. It took us years to figure out that we actually could run this analysis. And it bugs me because of these indirect effects. I wish we had this paper out 6 months after the election, and maybe the discussion would have gone differently about it. But yeah, if Twitter missed it, there's nothing we can do about it. That being said, these patterns, the logarithmic nature of this pattern, 1% of the sample accounting for 75% of the exposures, the fact that we find this over and over again, it leads me to suspect that we probably, if there are more hidden trolls, they probably would follow a similar pattern, is my guess. Is there a possibility that there were some hidden leftist trolls and we might have seen a power law on the left side too? Who knows? But, we know from Kate's work, this included left and right-wing trolls, and we still, we found these kind of power distributions. So it would have to be not that Twitter just missed it. It's that they systematically missed something that was very, very different. we can't rule it out. That's the problem. So all we can do is report on what we've got. In terms of the indirect effects of pushing topics, I can't believe I'm going to say this to Phil Menzer, but like, I think bots are much better at that. Like, I mean, I know from like my research on bots in Russia, right? Like one of the strangest thing we found for those, I don't know, this is a whole other talk we can give, but we wrote a series of papers about Russian bots before Russian trolls were a thing, when they were like literally bots that tweeted in Russian about Russian domestic politics. And it was like, turned out to be a huge proportion of all of Russian Twitter was these Russian bots at the time period we were looking at. But like a huge number of the tweets were just like, they were just tweeting newspaper headlines with no links. And we were like, it didn't make sense in any of the paradigms we had. And then we were like, oh, they're trying to manipulate search engine optimization. That's like the only way that pattern made sense. Like, why would you just throw a headline out without a link? Like, it doesn't even get clicks. It wouldn't even get anything. But we began to think it wasn't supposed to be seen by humans. It was just supposed to be seen by other algorithms. And so I think my answer to that is like, sure, they could have pushed topics, but again, I'm going to fall back on the political behavior thing is like, okay, so then do we really think that if they pushed, one day they made a trend? I mean, remember, these, like, again, they're a tiny drop in the bucket. I showed you how much more people there were tweeting just in the media, right? And politicians. Like, let's not forget, there were lots of Americans just tweeting about politics. The idea that a bunch of Russian trolls could change trending topics on Twitter is pretty far-fetched. And if they managed to do it like once, the idea that would change people's attitudes because they're like, oh, gun control is trending today, right? And Second Amendment is trending tomorrow. I find it, I'm skeptical in that regard. So, and maybe I've over updated in this regard, but I do think bots are pretty good at changing trending topics. Like, I think that's the kind of thing they're good for.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Sandro, you are next in line.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for your talk. Really enjoyed it. I'm Alex from Indiana University. I have two questions. One you partially answered. The first is about what do we know, or what do you know actually, about the efficacy of campaigns in general? I mean, suppose I could replicate your study, and rather than taking Russian trolls, consider, I don't know, the gun lovers from Arizona or the cowboys from Texas, the running campaign. And so how this campaign from Russia compares to other campaigns in general in terms of efficacy. And the second, I understand from the report by Renée DiResta that she wrote for the Senate at the time of these elections, that the concern was not so much in many cases to change the mind of Trump or Clinton's elector, but rather than maybe convincing a little portion in a key state to not to vote, because that would be sufficient to swing the result of an election that sometimes are decided over few votes in some key states, rather than changing the mind of a huge amount of people. Thanks.
Yeah. So on the first one, what do we know about efficacy of online campaigns? I don't think we know that much, right? Like, I mean, like, that's the problem. We don't really know a lot about this. We know there's tons of studies about political advertising, right? And I think my sense is like when political the word on this is, if political advertising really worked, why wouldn't the candidate who spent more money win every time? And why wouldn't every candidate make sure they spent more money? And so, I think there's senses that like the disparity in advertising spending can work. I think one of the big things that political advertising spending does, we think, is deter quality challengers. Like, you don't enter, people try to amass these large war chests so that in local races, people won't challenge you because it seems like they're going to get outspent too much. But in terms of like campaigns, obviously the Russian trolls thought pretending to be from Tennessee was going to be better than pretending to be from St. Petersburg. So would actually being from Tennessee be better? I think it would still get into this question of like, what proportion of the information environment is the campaign, followed by how convincing is the campaign? And remember, I showed you that stuff in the beginning of the election, like the beginning of the talk, which was like, a lot of the stuff they were sharing was like headlines to local newspapers, right? And why were they doing that? Like, it turns out it's a small number of accounts that were sharing these headlines to local newspapers. And somebody's, one theory I've heard speculated is that they were trying to build up trust as a trusted source of news, so that when Trump lost the election and claimed that it was fake, they could then pump out stuff that would support his claim that it was fake, only he won the election. So we have no idea if that was actually what he planned to do, although 2020 shows that that's probably a credible thing, that Trump would claim the election was fake if he lost it. So, who knows in that regard. Yeah, in terms of like the point, can we reject that, given that we saw these, we have these nulls, we only have 1,500 people. Do we have enough power to reject the idea that in one particular state, at one particular time, it changed enough votes? So we had a reviewer who was pretty into this idea too.
It wasn't me.
I know it wasn't you. I know who it was. They very nicely signed their review. I know exactly who it was.
Okay.
But we did a lot of work in this regard. And my sense is, no, we have 1,500 people. It's way better than anything we had before this, because before all this, we just had these people that Chris Bale found that he had when he was doing a different experiment in October of 2017, which wasn't the month anybody cared about. And it was after all these things got kicked off the platform. By the way, Chris Bale, their article, the Bale et al. Article, comes to the same conclusion as we do. It's like there's no relationship between being exposed to trolls and changing attitudes. So we have more information, but yeah, we would need much more power. We're not powered to detect an effect in Milwaukee. I don't even know if we have anyone from Milwaukee. So are we really missing something? It would have to be pretty Herculean, given that like what we saw here, that, that they were incredibly surgical on a platform that doesn't really let you be that surgical, right? And that the effects that we saw that were null effects across the whole population, that they really mattered for people in Milwaukee. And it would have to be a kind of big order of magnitude, to change things. So at the end of the day, I forget exactly what we did. And Greg's not on this call right now. Like, we spent a lot of time dealing with this. There's some bunch of stuff in the supplemental appendix. You can go check it out. Unfortunately, we cannot entirely reject it. It just seems, you'd have to make a lot of assumptions to be like, oh, given what we found in the only data anybody has about exposure, could it be masking this hyper-targeted, attack in one particular area that actually had a huge impact on people? Because in Milwaukee, everybody was on Twitter, and I think you'd have to make a lot of assumptions, but I can't reject it out of hand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Reality. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, Oscar, you're next.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the great presentation.
Thank
It was
you.
really, yeah. I want to first mention that I found the last point that you made was that it was really interesting, where you said that it might not have a direct influence on the elections. I mean, the Russian trolls, but it might have affected the way how people think about the robustness of the U.S. election system, which might affect which might somehow influence people's attitudes at the end. So that was a great point. I think. And I have two questions, which I might missed while I was listening, but sorry if I did. The first is you found that only 1% of the users account for the 70% of the exposure. Did you have a chance to check whether there's a difference between this 1%'s attitudes and the other ones? And the other question is, it's like a more open-ended question, and it's like you talked about this earlier, but we know that this 1% is all Republicans, strongly accepting towards being a Republican. Do you think that it would make a difference whether if they were to attack to the network of Twitter more randomly and made their ways to the timelines of the Democrats?
Yeah, those are both good questions. And actually, we never did go in and look at who these 15 people were, but you're not going to be able to make many statistical inferences from it. And again, we had a sample, and the big, we had a sample of people who were Twitter users, which is great. That's what we wanted. We wanted Twitter users. They were people who were willing to sign up for YouGov, so they were probably actually less conservative, based on a lot of what we know about how hard it is to get people into surveys who are conservatives. They're maybe not quite as conservative as the average, the mean across Twitter, although we didn't look at that. And then, these were people who were willing to give their Twitter handle to YouGov, which is another, which becomes another population. So it's not the ideal sample, would have been if somehow there was possibility to do this, to sample directly from Twitter. just take a random sample of the Twitter population and then get those people to take a survey, right? But that's very hard to do when you're not allowed to spam everybody on Twitter and ask them to come into your survey and these kinds of things. So anyway, there's just different ways of going about doing this in this regard. So, but my sense is, and what kind of inferences can you make from 15 people? But my sense is, from looking across the sample, that the people who are being exposed to these Russian trolls, as we said, they're heavily Republican, they're male, they look like the kind of people who are Trump voters to start with, right? Which might be why there's, little effect of having been exposed to more tweets. And one thing I mentioned is we measured it both in terms of the total number of tweets to which you were exposed, although we logged that because it was very skewed, or just were you exposed at all? Which leads to your second question, if they adopted a different strategy, might it have mattered? I mean, I think we have to be careful about this because it's not unidirectional, right? It's I am likely to get exposed to this kind of stuff because, remember the troll I showed you? It was proud Second Amendment, person, right? Who's likely to follow that? Who's likely to share that? Who's likely to retweet that? And then who am I likely to follow? If I'm following someone who loves to share a lot of stuff from an account that's called Proud Second Amendment, I'm not randomly selecting into that. So I think and this is the story just with so much that we're doing right now, where it's there's this complex interplay, right, of people's own social choices with the nature of the platforms. And so I'm not, I don't know that they did. I don't think that the goal when they did these IRA Twitter accounts was to necessarily we're going to just aim this at the people who really like us. I think it was we're going to set up these kind of accounts. And if Renee's story about including the Senate report story about increasing polarization and the work Kate's done about the left wing and the right wing trolls, you're trying to make it look left wing, you're trying to make it look right wing. And then so the type of people who are going to be attracted to those accounts are going to be kind of right wing. And for whatever reason, they seem to have just the trolls that were targeting the right, had the right wing flavor to them, and the ones that the right would seems to be produced a lot more content, I think. So I'm not particularly optimistic that if you just did a random sample, it would have had any different impact. And I don't know that in those 15, there might be some moderate people. There might be a couple liberals in there. I just don't know. I just know on average, it was more Republican and more male. Okay. Ooh, we're getting close to the end. So sorry.
No worries. Yeah, I was going to say, Alex, you can ask one question, but it's got to be really quick. And then Josh, if you could try to keep your answer also relatively short. We're going to do a plug for next week in a second. So,
okay.
Alex, go ahead.
I'll be quick. Thank you so much for the talk. I'll just want to hear your opinion about as you measured if there was a change in attitude, particularly if the exposure to Russian trolls changed people's votes. And you did not find any evidence for that. But what about the influence of I remember the Senate Intelligence Committee conducted a report on this, and one of their findings was that these Russian trolls exacerbated divisions. So even though change might not have been the cause, is it possible that entrenchment in the beliefs of people might have been a second-hand consequence, that people maybe for or against an issue being more entrenched in those points of views? So I don't know if this was something that you looked at.
Yeah, so you're asking about affective polarization, a little bit of affective polarization, how much you dislike the other party. Yeah, we looked a lot of times to see if we had included that survey question in these waves, and we hadn't. So I wish we had, but that's why we use the issue positions, right? Because that's exactly what we were trying to get at, was polarization. And it would have been great if we could have looked at affective polarization, but instead, in this particular case, we looked at, we ended up looking at straight ideological polarization. And in that case, there wasn't a relationship. Again, I'm skeptical that you would find any effect across a random sample like this, because so many people had so little exposure. The other thing I would say about polarization, which I'll put in a plug, which is that I've spent the last 3.5 years as the co-lead of something called the US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study. And we published 4 articles in Science and Nature at the end of July. And there's information about, we ran a bunch of experiments on trying to see if changing aspects of the Facebook experience and Instagram experience had an impact on polarization. And we looked at things that were hypothesized to do this, like the nature of the algorithm, virality, echo chambers, and we found nothing with 3-month-long experiments. And so that's a whole other talk. Maybe you guys will, if you guys want to invite me back, I can give that talk some other time. But I think it's just really hard to move polarization, really hard. And I think we made like big changes in people's platform experience. I think that dwarfs the fact, or sorry, that really is much is a much bigger potential change than just seeing a bunch of tweets from trolls. Like, we were changing the overall experience they were having on the, well, we were changing aspects of the platform experience, and we didn't find anything there. So I would continue to be skeptical that, like, given how much of a drop in the bucket these things were for most people. But the final thing I'll put in a pitch for is that, like, I think as a field, we need to be doing more research about what's happening in the tails, what's happening to these small groups of people. And that I don't know the answer to, right? What in those particular cases. And I'm not willing to go out on a limb and say, if exactly the right people are targeted with exactly the right types of messages in the next one of these things, whether there might be an effect in the tails. We just weren't powered to detect any of that stuff for this study. Okay, there you go. That was shortish.
Wonderful. Thank you, Josh. So if everybody could please give Josh another digital yellow hands clap. We'll thank him one last time. And then just to wrap up, I want to plug our talk next week. We have Dr. Gianluca Stragnini talking about computational methods to measure and mitigate online disinformation, which obviously is relevant given what we've just discussed. And with that, I'll just thank everybody for coming, and hopefully we will see you for future talks. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.